Hi everyone, my name's Nicki and welcome back to my channel. For those new here, I'm an author and editor and I post videos here on YouTube about books, writing, editing and generally all the things that I love. Now I'd like to especially welcome you today because this is my first official video in a new series. If you missed my introductory video yesterday, Crash Course Classics is going to be a monthly series in which I look at one author per month. I'll give you a quick biography, talk about some of their key works and how to approach reading them. Essentially, I want this just to be an introduction to different classic authors to hopefully get a few new readers interested in their works and to show you that they're not as inapproachable as they may sometimes seem. So to kick us off this week, I've chosen Victor Hugo. There's a few reasons for that. One of them is the fact that I've been reading some Hugo again recently, so he's on my mind. And also I thought it was a good one because Victor Hugo is really what got me started in the classics. I went to see the musical Les Miserables for my 12th birthday, fell in love with the story and decided to read the book. I have the copy here. I actually bought this for my mother who was interested in reading the book after seeing the musical, but the print is incredibly tiny and so she gave up, it was too small for her to read and it came to me. And it's a fairly dog-eared copy as you can see. I don't generally like turning down page corners, but this is one book where I have done it. I come back to this book pretty regularly and sometimes I just like to dip in and read my favourite passages. So it's a well-loved, treasured volume. And from reading Les Miserables, I then spent about 3 years reading nothing but classics, all in these yellow penguin editions you can see here, which we used to be able to get pretty cheap. So that's another reason why I decided to start off with Victor Hugo for this series. So I'm going to start off by just giving you a very brief biography. I've got a few notes here just so I remember all the key dates. Partly because I think it's important to set his works within the time he was writing. So, Victor Hugo was born in Besançon in 1802. So this is 3 years after Napoleon has risen to prominence. He's now first consul of France, having replaced the Directory which had been ruling France since the end of the revolutionary period, 1794-1795. So he is the third son of a career soldier in Napoleon's army, and as such they spent a lot of his early life travelling around following the army essentially in different camps. Now his father as a Napoleonic soldier is obviously a Republican, however his mother was a royalist, and in his early life he did tend to follow her principles more than his father's. Finally, when the Battle of Waterloo saw the end of Napoleon, Hugo was able to settle down to his studies a bit more seriously. He attended the Lycée Louis-le-Grand in Paris, pretty famous school, a lot of people went there. And he also graduated with a law degree, although he was already showing literary leanings at this point, probably from about 1816, 1817 onwards. He married his childhood friend Adele in 1821 and they had 5 children together. In that same year he published his first book of poems. And I should say at this point that although we tend to know Victor Hugo in the English-speaking world more for his novels, in France he's in some ways more celebrated for his poetry. He's one of their great national poets. He also published his first novel, Han of Iceland, in 1823. This is actually one I've not read yet. Some of these smaller novels, the older works, are a little bit harder to get hold of. So that's one I've not got to, but it's on my list. He joined a literary circle around this time, and it's people devoted to Romanticism, essentially. Romanticism was very much on the rise, 1820s onwards, and he emerged in 1827 with his verse drama Cromwell, because as well as novels and poems, he also wrote some works for the stage. By the 1830s, his views are becoming less royalist and very much more liberal. In 1831 he writes Notre Dame de Paris, which we know in English language as The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And at this point he's continuing to write plays, particularly for one of his main mistresses, Juliette Drouet. She's a terrible actress, but she is absolutely devoted to him and she actually stays pretty much by his side until her death in 1883. She was a huge influence on him in terms of his work. In 1841 he is elected to the Académie Française, which is quite an honour. and in 1845 he's nominated to the Chamber of Peers. So he was a very well respected writer within his lifetime. During the period he's writing, there's a lot of tension, social tension going on, I should say. Throughout the 1830s, 1840s, although the big French Revolution, as it were, is out of the way, there are a lot of smaller uprisings. 1830 is a successful one, 1832 unsuccessful, and that's the one during which Les Miserables, the barricade scenes, are set. And 1848 is another one, which we will come to in just a moment. There's a brief period of non-work for him in the early 1840s because of all the demands of his new positions, and he tragically loses one of his daughters to a drowning accident that also kills her husband, and that kind of makes him put aside his pen for a little while. During the Revolution of 1848, Hugo is elected a deputy for Paris to the Legislative Assembly. However, he's forced to flee France during Napoleon III's coup d'etat, which takes place in 1851. He lives in exile essentially from 1851 to 1870. He begins off in Brussels for about a year, and then he moves to the English Channel Islands. He stays in Jersey for a little while, but then he's forced to move over to Guernsey, and it's in Guernsey that he spends most of his time. You can actually visit his house there. It's a museum. I've been there. It's fascinating. I went when I was fairly young, so I don't remember a lot of details, except I remember one room was called the Red Room, and it was completely red. I mean, it was a very well named room. But that's just a little anecdote from the side. But Guernsey is a fairly small place, and he was there for a huge chunk of his exile. In fact, his novel, The Toilers of the Sea, just here, is about a Guernsey fisherman who is trying to win the hand of a local shipbuilder's daughter. So, he's in exile. At this point he's writing a lot of satire, a lot of fairly vitriolic works against Napoleon III. However, he goes on to write The Contemplations, which are a series of poems, probably some of his best-loved poems, published in 1856. He then returns to a work he'd already started and had been working on intermittently. That work was called Les Miserables, and he published that finally in 1862 to huge acclaim. With the proclamation of the Third Republic in 1871, Hugo returns to France. He's stricken with illness in 1878, however he lives on until 1885. When he dies, he's given a state funeral and he is buried in the Pantheon in Paris. So although he fell in and out of favour depending on the regime, essentially he was a well-loved writer throughout his lifetime. So that's a brief biography. Now let's take a little bit of a closer look at some of his works and the themes and style of his writing. So, Victor Hugo. For some of his key works, I'm going to place a little list on the screen beside me, but essentially we are looking at Les Miserables, Notre-Dame de Paris, L'Homme qui rit, quatre-vingt-treize, Toilers of the Sea. Now you can see pretty much all these books behind me. This is actually the graphic novel version of The Man Who Laughs, L'Homme qui rit. I have read the sort of main version in an English translation on Project Gutenberg, but I still have to read it in French, and I do want to do that eventually. Toilers of the Sea, Notre-Dame de Paris, Les Miserables, quatre-vingt-treize. I actually have 2 copies of quatre-vingt-treize. Shaw's View is just some of his remarks, contemplations on his life during these years, 1830 to 1885, and Les Miserables in French as well as English. So, themes in Victor Hugo. There's obviously a great impact on the times in which he's living. There's a lot of social upheaval, a lot of revolution going on, and that really reflects in his writing. So justice is hugely important to him. In some of his books he concentrates more on legal justice, the justice system, but he also talks often about social justice, or more importantly social injustice. So, I mean, if we look at some of the works, The Man Who Laughs very much looks at the legal justice system and the social justice system, because Gwynplaine, our hero, was done out of his inheritance, sold off to the Comprachicos, who mutilated his face, or because his father had rebelled against the king. However, in later life, the new queen decides that she wants to reinstate him in his peerage. And that causes him all sorts of problems, probably more problems than he had beforehand, because it completely changes his social status. If we look at something like Notre Dame de Paris as well, there's again elements of both types of justice in the book. We're looking at the social justice in terms of the way Esmeralda lives, the way Quasimodo is treated, as opposed to people like Foro and Phoebus. And in particular, we look at legal justice in terms of how Esmeralda is treated with her supposed attack on Phoebus. Les Miserables, again, both are seen in this book. We have the legal justice in terms of the Valjean-Javert policeman-convict relationship, but social injustice is obviously a huge theme throughout the novel, how the poor are treated, how they have to live, and then the student uprising against the current establishment that takes place on the barricades. And I mean, quatre-vingt-treize is probably less well known than some of these others. That's set during the French Revolution, the year 1793. So that's obviously a very revolutionary based work as well. With Victor Hugo, he writes in a very poetic language, and I think you can really see that he is a poet in his novels. For instance, if you think about something like Les Miserables, in Les Miserables there's a wonderful scene in which Marius writes a letter to Cosette, leaves it under a stone in the garden in the Rue Plumet, which she then finds and reads, and it's full of just these beautiful poetic phrases about love that he's written inspired by her. In the English translation, that chapter is called Heart Under the Stone, I think. Then, for instance, the description of Enjolras. Enjolras is one of my favourite characters. He's the leader of the revolutionaries in Les Miserables, and he is described as being a charming young man capable of being terrible. And they talk about his appearance, and Hugo describes him as having a very high forehead, and then he says, much forehead in a face is like much sky in the horizon. And that's the kind of poetic style of a lot of Hugo's language. So he's talking about all these very deep themes of social injustice, but he's doing it in this really beautiful, poetic way. Another thing to note is that in typical 19th century fashion, he is fairly wordy, fairly verbose in some of his descriptions. And that's something that, as a reader, if you're a modern day reader and you're not used to this style, it's just something that you need to get used to acquaint yourself with in order to appreciate the classics. It may be quite hard, the first one or two books, because it is a very different style of writing than we're used to nowadays. But trust me that if you stick with it and you get used to it, you'll get so much from these stories. The other little foible of Hugo's are his digressions. He is quite bad at drifting off the subject. An example of this, Les Miserables. It happens quite a lot in Les Miserables. First of all, he launches into this random description of the Battle of Waterloo in the middle of the story. Now, some of the characters were at Waterloo. Thénardier was at Waterloo and saved Marius' father, which is sort of brings up part of the conflict in the story, so it is relevant in that way. However, we don't really, as readers, need a whole description of the Battle of Waterloo. When I reread the book, I do confess I skip it. And you can do this with Hugo. Once you've read it once and you know where they are, you can skip some of these digressions. But he does it again. It's a very interesting description about argot, which is the street slang at the time. However, once you've read it once, it's not really all that relevant to the story, and you can gloss over it future times. And he has another section where he does several pages of history just dumped in the middle of the story as well. And he does this in all his books to a certain extent. Les Miserables is particularly bad for it, but there's also in The Man Who Loves L'Encurie, there's also a bit of a passage about the period. That's actually an historical novel for Hugo. So many of these novels, Les Miserables, Toilers of the Sea, they're all based fairly contemporary. However, Man Who Laughs, Notre Dame de Paris, and Quatre-vingt-treize are all historical novels. Quatre-vingt-treize is not quite as historical, but The Man Who Laughs is set in a different century, as is Hunchback of Notre Dame. I nearly said, confused the French and English titles in the title then, but so he's writing a mix of historical fiction and contemporary fiction, essentially. So that's a little bit of an introduction to his works. So what I'd like to do now to finish is just talk about how can we approach Victor Hugo. So we know that he's wordy, we know he has digressions, but he has very beautiful poetic language. If you're someone new to this, where do you want to start with Victor Hugo? My recommendation, Notre-Dame de Paris. Considering the length of some of the other books, I mean this one looks thin, but that's just because it's the graphic novel. The actual novel is pretty hefty. Notre-Dame de Paris is one of the smaller novels, so in terms of size it's very approachable. I think it's a good one to start with because even if you've never read Hugo's work, most people are vaguely familiar, at least, with Esmeralda, Quasimodo, whether you've seen the Disney film versions, you know, everyone's kind of knows roughly the story. So that gives you a bit of an advantage as you approach it. Language-wise, it's fairly accessible compared to some of Hugo's other stuff too. So that is where I recommend you start, Hunchback of Notre Dame, Notre-Dame de Paris, if you're going to read Victor Hugo for the first time. Another way you might like to approach this is by looking at some film TV versions before you approach the books. With Notre-Dame de Paris, there have been a lot of film versions. Obviously, you know, you've got the Disney and that, but I recommend checking out some of the proper live-action film versions. Les Miserables. If you're going to watch a version of Les Miserables, do not please watch the Liam Neeson film version. It is absolutely appalling. It completely destroys the book, it changes bits of the story wherever it feels like it. It's awful, so don't watch it. I would recommend a 4-part TV series that is starring Gerard Depardieu as Valjean and John Malkovich as Javert. Now this is in French, however there are English subtitled versions around for it. You should be able to get the DVD with English subtitles. It's a marvellous version. When the French do their own literature, they do tend to be very accurate. That's one of the advantages of watching the French film versions if you can, whether you speak French or whether you can find it with subtitles, because they adore their own literature, they won't ruin it. So they're very dedicated to preserving the text. And this version of Les Miserables, as I said, with Gerard Depardieu, is awesome. Really great version, very true to the story. They obviously have to miss out a few bits here and there, but they keep it pretty accurate. There are also, of course, the musicals. So the musical of Les Miserables condenses the story considerably, cuts out a lot of secondary characters, and it kind of has to for that length, but it's still a nice introduction if you just want to get introduced to the main characters before you approach the book. There's a really good musical version now, The Grinning Man of L'Enquire, which is actually closing in London in a few days' time. I don't know whether there's going to be a cast album yet, but you can find some of the music on YouTube, so worth having a look at. And for Notre-Dame de Paris, there is a very good musical version. It's actually a French-Canadian musical, which is available on DVD, certainly in French and Italian. And there are CDs available, full CDs in French and Italian, highlight CDs I know in English, Spanish, Russian, I'm pretty sure. So do have a look. Some of the stuff's on YouTube as well. If you look up the musical on YouTube, you might find bits of it as well. But those are some good places to start if you're looking to read some Victor Hugo and if you want to see some stage or film versions first. So that was a little bit of an introduction to Victor Hugo. I hope you found it entertaining, useful. If you've got any comments or any questions you want to ask about Hugo, pop them below in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them for you. I hope you've enjoyed this first Crash Course Classics video, and I will be back next time to discuss another author and their works. I look forward to seeing you all again then, I hope. Bye for now, everyone.